Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 2, where we will be talking about sources of information and how to find the best research. So, how do we learn about the world? That's a question. Many of us know a lot of things about the world, but many of you have not done an actual research study. So, how did you learn about the world? Well, one thing is your experience, your intuition, or your common sense. That's one way we learn a lot about the world. It makes sense to us. That's the idea of your intuition. It just makes sense, and so that's how you know it to be true. You have experienced it in your life, and therefore you believe that it's true. One of the examples of this, kind of best examples, is the idea that many, many years ago in history, people thought the world was flat, right? Why did people think the world was flat? Well, look down at the ground. It looks pretty flat, right? It made sense that the world is flat. You probably remember learning this, that, right, people thought you could walk over the edge of the earth at some point. And it was only once we were able to kind of have more scientific understanding that we know now that the world is round. So the point here is that your intuition or your common sense is not always correct, right? The ground might look flat. You might think the earth is flat, but yet that's incorrect, right? Except, of course, I always tell my husband that my intuition is always right. So that's the only difference, right? But that is one way we learn quite a lot about the world, even though it's not always correct. Another way we learn about the world is by authority, meaning that someone in a position of authority told you something is true. Your teacher could tell you something is true. You read it on the internet, therefore it must be true, right? Someone in government tells you it's true, therefore it must be true, etc., right? That's one way we learn a lot, is we read about it, we hear about it from someone in a position of authority, and therefore we learn it to be true. Again, that's can be correct, but not always correct. A good example of this is the tooth fairy. Here she is, right? When you were little, probably many of you believed in the tooth fairy, and that there was a little fairy that, I don't know, came in once you lost a tooth in your window at night and grabbed your tooth and maybe put money under your pillow. And is there a tooth fairy? I hope I'm not messing this up for anybody, right? There is no tooth fairy. But who told you about the tooth fairy? Your parents, right? Like the ultimate authority figure when you are 5 or 6 years old. They told you this story, you believed it to be true, but yet it was not true. And so that's another great example of when someone in a position of authority tells you something, it doesn't always mean it's true. You also need to look at who the authorities are. Jenny McCarthy has had a lot of influence over people in terms of her discussions about autism, and that vaccines might be responsible for autism, and people trust her, not because she's a scientist or a doctor, but because she's a celebrity. And what she is saying about vaccines is absolutely not true. And in fact, we will talk about that later in this class, that there is absolutely no relationship between vaccines and autism. And so you have to think about who is the authority figure who's telling you the information. That authority figure, even if it's a professor at college, can still be incorrect sometimes. So it doesn't mean they're absolutely always right, but you want to think about who is the authority you're listening to. Also, when you learn things based on your experience or your common sense, you don't have a comparison group or a control group. And that is really important. When we do research, we're always comparing two groups. So you would always be asking yourself this question in your life, compared to what? because we don't live our life as an experiment where we do things one way and then do things in a controlled environment and then use a treatment. We just live our lives. And so certain things may happen and we go, that's so interesting. When I had pizza for dinner the night before finals, I got an A on my finals. So must be that eating pizza causes me to get A's on finals. I should always eat pizza the night before my finals. But we don't have a comparison group. And so that is one of the keys of actual research, is that we need to have a comparison or a control group. We'll be talking about that as well. Our experience is also confounded. Confound or confounded is a big word in research. It basically means confused. If we have confounds, we have multiple explanations for why our data turned out the way it did. And again, that could be our pizza example. I ate pizza the night before finals and I got A's on my finals. Well, what else did I do that day? Did I get a really good night's sleep as well? Did I don't know, have a study group that I studied with for that class? Did I really like that class and was really interested and motivated? I don't know. So was it the pizza that caused me to get the good grades? Or was it because I slept really good the night before the test? Or was it because I used a study group? This is all confounded or confused, and our experience is that way. When we do research, we isolate variables, we control variables, we have very specific rules that we'll learn about so that we only look at one thing at a time instead of multiple possible explanations. And then we control all the other variables. So we keep all the groups equal. Again, if I was really testing if pizza would lead to better grades on final exams, I would maybe have 2 groups at the very least. And everything about those groups would be the same. They would study the same amount of time. They would all have a study group, let's say. They would all fill out a study guide. They would all sleep for the same amount of time the night before the test. Everything would be the same. The only difference is one group would eat pizza the night before and one group would eat, I don't know, something else. And then I would compare the results. So you can't do this in your own personal experience. This is why we need research. So you can see that using your own intuition, what makes sense, what somebody told you, to learn things about the world is problematic. It may be true, and very often your intuition is correct. Your experience is correct. What people tell you is correct, but not always. And that brings us to empirical research, which is what we'll be learning about in this class, right? Empirical meaning observable research. And these research studies that we'll learn to complete in this class are better than experience because, number one, we always use a comparison group, at least one, sometimes more than one. And that is really important. This was a interesting study. You can read more about it in your book about the idea of catharsis and aggression. And the idea here is that people, all the way back to Freud, had the idea that getting your anger out or having a cathartic experience would then have you feel less aggressive. So you're sort of building up aggression or anger or something, and then if you could have this cathartic moment, this release in a safe way, I don't know, you might have heard like punch your pillow if you are getting angry, or stomp your feet really hard on the floor, or just scream really loudly. Get it out and then you'll feel better. And in some ways that makes sense. And it even makes sense, this, back historically, they kind of use this idea of a steam engine, that a steam engine would kind of build pressure, and then eventually you would need to let that pressure out, or else the whole thing would explode. And they sort of use that as a metaphor for the idea of a human being kind of getting all of their anger and frustration. If you bottle it up inside of you, eventually, you'll explode. And so you need a safe way to get out these negative feelings. Well, made a lot of sense, and you've probably heard this. Someone probably told you at some point in your life, if you're frustrated, right, punch a pillow. That's this idea translated into everyday life. But somebody did a study on the idea of catharsis and aggression, and they used comparison groups. This was very key. And the details are that there were 3 groups. Somebody came in, the research participant, as well as a confederate. A confederate is someone who's part of the research study, but the person doesn't know that they're part of the research study. And I'm now forgetting exactly what the study was. They might have had you do a test. They've done this in many ways. I'm not sure the example they use in the book. They have you do a test or give a speech or something. And then the confederate, the person who's part of the research study, but you don't know that, says like, that was the worst speech I've ever heard. Boy, or that you did worse on this test than anyone's ever done, or something like that to make you feel angry. The goal is to get you to feel angry. And then the 3 groups, they had one group who, after that experience where they were feeling angry, was allowed to sit quietly. Another group who got to punch a punching bag, sort of an exercise catharsis experience. And another group who was asked to punch the punching bag, but imagine that confederate, his name was Steve, imagine that punching bag was Steve's face, and you're getting your anger out about Steve by punching this punching bag. Okay, and that's the real cathartic idea of catharsis, is you're taking this emotional anger and getting it out. And what happened after that? Well, they can't then let you go meet Steve and go be violent, but they have people play different kinds of video games where you can do different kinds of aggressive actions. And so they put people in, the research participant, and they tell you there are other participants in different rooms. You may not know that those people are not really there, they're confederates. And you have a chance to do an aggressive type of behavior. Very often it's blasting a very loud noise at somebody. So that would be our way to simulate the idea of feeling angry or aggressive. And the idea would be that if catharsis worked, and then you go to play this video game with Steve or somebody else, if you've already gotten out all your anger, you would be less likely to blow that horn in a very loud way, or make that noise in a very loud way, because you would be feeling much better. However, what did they find? Really the opposite. That people who, after they were feeling angry, just were allowed to sit quietly, ended up being less aggressive to their partner in the game. Whereas people who did that, I'm putting quotes around cathartic experience here, those air quotes, punched a punching bag, imagining it was Steve, they were actually more aggressive partner in the game. And so it was actually the opposite results. And even though, again, the idea of catharsis makes sense, seems to be reasonable, once you have a comparison group and do a real controlled study, you might find the opposite results. Behavioral research is what we call probabilistic, which means that its findings are not expected to explain all the cases all the time. In psychology, we study human beings, and there are lots of variables, right? People have different levels of motivation and different levels of intelligence and different levels of all sorts of things. And so when we find research results, we say they're probabilistic. The results apply to most people, but not to everyone. There are exceptions to the rule. For example, we know that there is an association between SAT scores and GPA in college. That's why colleges ask people to take the SAT. it turns out that people who get higher SAT scores tend to have higher GPAs in college, and people who have lower SAT scores tend to have lower GPAs in college. But that isn't the case for everyone, right? You can imagine someone who gets a super high SAT score, but gets to college and they're lazy and they don't want to go to class and they fail out of college, right? Or people who get very low SAT scores but work super hard in college and get great GPAs in college. So this may be a trend, a way that it happens most of the time, but there are exceptions to every rule. So we have to remember that when we're talking about behavioral research, which is different than maybe if you're doing physics or chemistry. Every time you, with chemistry, add this amount of some chemical to a certain amount of another chemical, you always get a particular reaction. Not with psychological research, not with the research on people. There are just too many variables. Also, when we use our experience and our intuition is biased. We can be swayed by a good story. That's the idea of Freud and catharsis, who came up with this great idea. And like we talked about, this steam engine, that if we've got all this steam pressure building up, eventually that engine will explode. And so same should kind of make sense with people, that if you have all this negative energy building up, eventually you'll explode. And so we want to sort of give you opportunities to have a catharsis kind of moment where you let out in a safe way some of this negative energy. Well, again, you saw the research doesn't prove that to be true, but in our intuition, it just makes sense. We can be swayed by a good story. Our intuition is also biased by being persuaded by what comes to mind easily. We call this the availability heuristic, that what comes to your mind quickly is the easiest thing to believe. And here's an example in terms of cause of death, right? You can see here that what's the most common cause of death here is lung cancer, right? Very few homicides. But when we talk, what are people afraid of, right? What do we say? I'm always, my children, they have to be safe. I need to be sure someone's always watching them because something terrible could happen to them. Whereas, again, lung cancer probably is the more common thing to happen, but it's the homicides that are in the newspaper and on the radio, and you hear about it on the news, and so it's available, it's in your mind, and so that's what you think about. This is also me with shark attacks at the beach, right? You can tell, maybe I worry a little too much about my children, but I'm always thinking when we're at the beach, oh my gosh, a shark, what if a shark comes? Why? Is it very common for shark attacks to happen? No. Right? Compared to other things like traffic accidents that we're in the car all the time, and I'm not worried about that all the time. But when there is a shark attack, right, it's everywhere and you hear about it. And so that's what comes to mind, which is why, again, our intuition, we have to be careful, because what we think is true, in this case, what we think is most dangerous might be, being at risk of a homicide, whereas actually, that is the least common thing you need to be worried about. Failing to think about what we cannot see, call this the present bias. We tend to focus on what you are thinking about, and that leads to the response you are interested in, and not the number of times you did whatever you're thinking about that didn't lead to the response. Okay, that's confusing. So how about this? My mom, when I call her, I can't tell you how many times I call her and she picks up the phone and goes, oh my gosh, you and I must have this like psychic connection because I was just thinking about calling you and then you called. And so like, we're just like connected somehow through the universe. Which is very sweet. However, there are probably lots of times my mom thinks of me and I don't call her. But she doesn't think about those times. She's only focusing on the present bias, that when she is thinking of me and I do call, that confirms her idea that we have this special connection, right? And so our intuition, again, is biased in that way, because when, again, let's go to the pizza example. If another year later I eat pizza before the finals and I get the finals, take finals again, and I do well, I can think, oh my gosh, this happened twice. Twice I ate pizza before finals, twice I did well, not thinking about all the other meals I had and all the other tests I had, and maybe I did well on those too, right? But I'm just thinking about, oh, I was wondering about this pizza final exam association. And then we also focus on the evidence we like best. That's human nature. We cherry pick the information we like and accept it if it supports what we already think. We call this the confirmation bias. Again, this doesn't mean we do this on purpose, but it's just the way that our brains work, right? I liked a couple of these cartoons. Did you fact check this before reposting it? I don't need to. It agrees with my preconceived views and biases, so it must be true, right? I know what I think is true. This article says it's true, so I'm going to believe the article and not actually do the fact checking behind it. Same thing. I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth. They Google something. Here's the first link that agrees with what you believe. Jackpot, I'm done. I'm right, right? Not looking at the other research that's there. So we have a tendency to look for evidence that supports whatever it is we believe, right? And of course, as humans, our intuition and the way our brains work, we are biased about being biased. It's called a bias blind spot. We don't think we're biased, even though we are. And I love this quote. It's sad. Your views are so selective. Why can't others be more objective like me? We think we're objective, but we all have our own biases. And actually, if you do decide to go on and to go on into psychology and maybe go on to graduate school, be a counselor, a psychologist, we spend a lot of time and a lot of our training working on understanding our own biases, because your own bias and your own perspective truly filters the way you see the world. And as a psychologist, you really need to look back, look as clearly and as objectively as you can. You can never get rid of your own perspective and experiences and personal biases, but we do spend a lot of time working on how to be as objective as possible. But we all kind of have this idea that everyone else has their own kind of skewed way of looking at the world, but mine is right. Which brings us to the idea of observation and empiricism in science. We don't have to throw away our intuition, our experience, or what other people have told us, but we can use those tools to guide our empirical research. So I might think that eating pizza is really going to be the key to getting good grades on an exam, because that happened to me. I can say in my experience, every time I ate pizza the night before a final, I did better on the test. So I can say, great, now I'm going to do a research study. I use my experience, I use my intuition to come up with my research ideas. So that's the way that intuition and experience and authority kind of blend and give us ideas to do our research studies. We don't just stop, though, at our experience or intuition and say, based on my one experience, now I know it's true. No, based on that experience, you design a research study to see if the research really does show that it's true. So we often make mistakes when we base our reasoning on intuition rather than science. Researchers create comparison groups and look at all the data, and that is really key. Journal articles. So these are the scientific sources that we would want to consult to really learn something in a scientific way. Journal articles, that's our most important source of getting information. There are what we call empirical journal articles, and these are articles where a researcher does a research study and they write up their results. And there's a very specific way of writing up your research results in, we call it APA format, American Psychological Association format. We're going to spend this whole semester learning how to write up research articles and practicing doing that. Okay, so in APA format, and these are these articles that are in journals, and the journals, like I said, have different topics, and you read through and read other people's research to understand what they've done and what the current state of the research is. There are also what we call review journal articles, and this would be, I don't know, if you were really interested in, let's say, cell phones, people using cell phones and being distracted, kind of multitasking, how does using your cell phone affect studying skills or other multitasking abilities while you're, on your cell phone and doing other things. Well, there have probably been hundreds of studies, if not thousands of studies on this. So you could read each individual study, or somebody might say, like I could say, Dr. Spilkin, I go, well, really interested in this area. I'm going to write a review article, which means I'm going to read all the studies on cell phones and multitasking that are out there. And then I'm going to put all that information together into one paper so that it reviews all of the individual studies. And that's kind of nice because then if somebody else is interested in this topic, they can read my review article and not have to find all those hundreds of individual papers. We briefly talked about the peer review process. I will talk about it again, but this is so that we are confident that the journal articles that we read in scientific journals are accurate and very precise, which is really the point of science. And so after I do a research study and write my paper up, I send it to a journal, to an editor, who then sends it to these peer reviewers, which means these are other scientists who are experts in the field. They do this anonymously, meaning they take my name off the paper. So I've done this. I've written many journal articles. They take my name, Dr. Spilkin's name's off the paper, send it out, and other experts in that field will read the paper. And it's basically usually between 3 and 5 reviewers. And you can imagine this is like having 3 of your hardest teachers ever critiquing your paper. And it can be any comments from small comments like you didn't, I don't know, there should be a new paragraph here, or I don't think this word is spelled correctly, things like that, to big issues like I don't think you did the right statistical analysis, or how come you didn't review certain articles that are out there in the literature, and I really think you need to add that, to I don't think your data supports your conclusion, etc. So each of these reviewers write you feedback, and it could be 1 page of feedback, it could be 10 pages of feedback and comments. Then this all gets sent back to you as the researcher, and you have to go through and respond to every single item from every single reviewer. Now, this doesn't mean you have to make all the changes. Very often you will agree with them. Oh yeah, that was spelled not, incorrectly. I need to change that. Or, I should look at this one other research article and add that to my paper. I'll do that. Sometimes you disagree, and if you disagree, you have to write a comment back to the reviewer as to why you disagree. Well, this is why I use this particular statistical analysis, and you wanted me to use a different one. This is why I don't think that would be appropriate. After you do all that, you send it back to the editor, who sends it back to the reviewers, and they re-review it. And then you basically can either get a letter saying, yep, it's ready for publication, Or a letter back saying, you know, after you made those changes, it's rejected. It's really not ready for publication in our journal, and we don't really think it ever will be. Or you could go through the process again, which they call revise and resubmit, which means they all look at your comments and now they reread your paper and now there are more questions. They send more questions back to you, you answer them, change the paper, and send it back again. And you could go through this 2, 3, 4 times, this revise and resubmit process. But the goal is that by the time you're done, your paper is really, really precise, which is very important. It's hard. You sort of have to build up a little bit of a tough skin if you're a researcher, because the first time you get all those comments back, you know, these papers and research studies you work on could be a 5-year project. You could have spent 5 years gathering this data, doing this study, writing the paper, and they kind of become like your children, your babies, and you think they're perfect, right? And then you send them off to a reviewer and they have all sorts of questions and comments and sort of can, I don't know, make you feel a little bit bad. But then as you start going through them and the comments and the questions and the concerns, I will tell you every single paper I've published is better at the end of the process than it was at the beginning. So there's a reason for this peer review process. It's very important, but it's this back and forth process to make the papers as rigorous and as precise as possible. Other sources to get information. So chapters in edited books or full-length books. Books are not edited with the scientific rigor of articles. So those peer-reviewed articles, that's really where we get our information because they go through that peer-reviewed process. That is not the case with textbooks and things like that. And so even though you may read them or you might use a part of a book for a reference for a paper maybe you're writing, we typically don't use them to get as a scientific source because they really don't go through that very strict peer review process. And we will be learning how to find peer-reviewed journal articles using either PsycInfo or Google Scholar, and we'll talk about that in a different lecture. And in terms of reading research, as I said, we write our papers in what's called APA, American Psychological Association style. Every article has the same sections. They're always in the same order: an abstract, an introduction, a method section, a results section, a discussion section, and a reference section. We are going to be going through each of these sections, and you'll be learning how to write each of these sections one at a time as we go through the class. And you're going to be reading, read other people's articles, and we're reading with a purpose. When you're reading a journal article, you're looking at what is the argument they're trying to make, what's the question they're trying to answer, and what is the evidence to support their argument. Do you believe it? Is it good? Are there any confounds? These are keywords we'll be talking about. And same with chapters and review articles. You don't just read it for face value and you just take what they're saying as the truth. You're reading it saying, what are they trying to prove here? And did they do a good job? And that's how, again, as we go through this class, you're going to end up being a good consumer of research. You're going to be able to read these research articles and feel, yeah, I do think they did this study appropriately and I can believe their conclusions, or I don't think they did. I see some confounds. I see some confusion in what they did and I'm not so sure I can believe it. Of course, there are less scholarly places to find information, particularly about psychology, on the bookshelves, or I guess Amazon, Wikipedia, the internet, etc. We would never use any of these types of publications as a basis for finding scientific information. Okay, these are really made for, I don't know, the lay person to learn a little bit about psychological research, but we would never use it in the basis of coming up with our own scientific study. All right, thank you all very much.